Humans normally dwell at the bottom of the atmosphere, where sea level air pressure is about 14.7 pounds per square inch, or about 30 inches of mercury as measured by a barometer. The air we breathe is roughly 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and 1% other gases. As we breathe, air is brought into the lungs, and the oxygen we need is forced through the thin-walled sacs of the alveoli, where it then passes into the bloodstream. The pressure of the atmosphere is what pushes the air through the walls of the alveoli. The blood transports the oxygen to the cells where it is burned to fuel our body, and the byproduct, carbon dioxide, is then carried back to the lungs and is exhaled. The buildup of CO2 in the lungs is what triggers the breathing reflex. Nitrogen is also carried throughout the body by the bloodstream, some of it going into suspension in the cells. Nitrogen is an inert gas, and under normal pressures has no effect on the body. Hypoxia is a condition in which the body, or part of the body, is deprived of adequate oxygen. Perhaps the most common type of hypoxia experienced by pilots is hypoxic hypoxia, where there is not enough oxygen available to the brain. Just like a mountain climber, a pilot will encounter reduced air pressure as they climb to the higher altitudes. Although the ratio of oxygen is the same, the pressure of the atmosphere is reduced, resulting in less air being pushed into the lungs. Pilots compensate for this in one of two ways, either by pressurizing the air inside the cockpit and cabin of the airplane, or by breathing 100% oxygen through a mask. High-performance aircraft, such as airliners and corporate jets, use their engines to pump compressed air into the cockpit and cabin, keeping the relative pressure high enough to force air into the lungs. Pilots of unpressurized aircraft breathe supplemental oxygen from oxygen tanks. However, breathing 100% oxygen from a mask typically only works up to about 40,000 feet. Most smaller aircraft don't carry oxygen systems or have pressurized cockpits, so pilots of these aircraft need to be aware of the reduced oxygen with an increase in altitude. In fact, the FAA has imposed limits on how high a pilot can go without being on supplemental oxygen. With the decrease in oxygen in your bloodstream, there is a decrease in your vision and mental functioning. That is also why they recommend going on oxygen at 10,000 feet in the daytime, but only 5,000 feet at night, as your eyes need extra oxygen to function at night. Stagnant hypoxia occurs when there is a decrease in blood flow to the cells in your body. Simply put, your body cannot circulate your blood. This is first evident in your vision and then your brain function. Fighter pilots and aerobatic pilots experience stagnant hypoxia when the G-forces created by quick changes of acceleration prevent the blood from flowing normally. This interrupts the supply of oxygen to the eyes and brain, which results in a blackout. Special straining and breathing techniques can be used to reduce the effect of stagnant hypoxia. Hypemic hypoxia occurs when the blood is unable to accept and transport oxygen. For pilots, this may occur if carbon monoxide is entering the cockpit, perhaps from a leaking cabin heater. Smokers also suffer hypemic hypoxia whenever they inhale smoke. The hemoglobin in your blood absorbs carbon monoxide 200 times more rapidly than oxygen. When carbon monoxide binds with your red blood cells, they have no room to carry the oxygen your body needs. Carbon monoxide is a byproduct of all internal combustion engines and combustion heaters and is odorless and colorless. Many aircraft have carbon monoxide detectors to alert flight crews if carbon monoxide enters the cockpit. Histotoxic hypoxia occurs when there is enough oxygen in the blood, but the body's cells are unable to make use of it. This form of hypoxia can occur when the body has been poisoned by drugs or alcohol. It should be noted that drinking just 1 ounce of alcohol has the same effect as climbing 2,000 feet in terms of oxygen impairment. The lack of oxygen creates visual and mental impairment. Symptoms are lightheadedness, a feeling of euphoria, dizziness, blue fingernails and lips, also known as cyanosis, tingling in the extremities, and headache. The symptoms experienced differ by person, and each may not be experienced by everyone. Prolonged hypoxia will result in unconsciousness, and at high altitudes, it may result in an untimely death. If you notice any of these symptoms, it is important to increase your intake of oxygen. Check your cabin pressurization or oxygen system. If it is malfunctioning, you need to descend to a lower altitude quickly. If you suspect carbon monoxide poisoning, turn off any cabin heaters, open all fresh air sources, and land as soon as possible. When under stress or experiencing anxiety, some people will breathe too rapidly. This way of breathing results in hyperventilation, where too much carbon dioxide is being exhaled and creates a lack of CO2 in the blood. The resulting symptoms of dizziness, weakness, fainting, and tingling sensations of the lips, hands, and feet are very similar to the symptoms of hypoxia. What's more, the symptoms can cause anxiety, which in turn stimulates more hyperventilation and exacerbates the symptoms further. It is important to diagnose hyperventilation correctly and not confuse it with hypoxia and vice versa. The symptoms of hypoxia can also cause a pilot anxiety, which could trigger hyperventilation, aggravating that situation. To a new pilot, some maneuvers such as stalls may be stressful, just as a real emergency would be stressful to an experienced pilot. Treatment for hyperventilation is accomplished by deliberately slowing your breathing down to a normal rate. If necessary, you can breathe into a paper bag, which allows you to rebreathe your exhaled CO2, helping your body regain proper CO2 balance more quickly. It is possible to suffer from both hypoxia and hyperventilation at the same time. If you're not sure which one you have, it's always safer to put on an oxygen mask and take deeper, slower, controlled breaths. Remember how 78% of the air around us is made up of nitrogen? When we breathe, nitrogen gas gets absorbed by the body, some of it going into suspension in our cells, some of it being exhaled. At constant pressure, the nitrogen causes no harm. But if we transition quickly to a lower pressure, not enough nitrogen can leave our body through normal respiration. The excess will then bubble out from the cells and can cause damage around joints and nerves. For general aviation pilots and passengers, the encounter of decompression sickness is often due to scuba diving before a flight. During a dive, a scuba diver is subjected to increased pressures. For each 33 feet of depth, the water pressure increases by 1 atmosphere, or about 17 psi. What this means is that the deeper a diver goes, and the longer he or she stays down, the greater the amount of nitrogen that is absorbed by their body. Divers can go down and stay down long, but need to make decompression stops at designated depths to outgas the surplus nitrogen. Even after making the decompression stops, a diver could still face decompression sickness if they were to continue ascending to higher altitudes, say in an airplane. This is why pilots need to know that they should not take anyone flying that has been scuba diving until that person has been on the surface for at least 12 hours or 24 hours for anyone who has done a dive requiring decompression stops. Symptoms of decompression sickness are joint pain, called the bends, tingling sensations, seizures, and unconsciousness. Treatment is accomplished by quickly descending to a lower altitude and administering 100% oxygen if available. Finally, a trip to a hospital or a diver's recompression chamber would repressurize the individual and remove the gas bubbles from their blood. As we climb and descend, the air pressure around us changes. The internal cavities behind the eardrum and the sinuses also need to equalize. This keeps the internal and external pressures the same. When pressure changes are small and slow, this presents no problem. However, when the pressure change is rapid or the ventilation passages are constricted due to a cold or sinus condition, then equalizing the internal pressure with the outside air can be difficult. Pressure on the outside of your eardrum is balanced by the inner ear air pressure. The inner ear equalizes through eustachian tubes, which travel from your inner ear to the back of your throat. When ascending to a higher altitude, the outside air pressure decreases and the higher internal pressure can easily vent out. However, when descending, the eustachian tubes tend to squeeze closed due to the higher outside pressure and do not allow the ears to easily equalize. Some people have voluntary control of the muscles that flex the eustachian tubes and can equalize the pressure with little difficulty. Others must swallow, yawn, or chew to flex the eustachian tubes. If these methods fail, you can try something called the Valsalva maneuver. Hold your nose closed with your fingers and blow through your nose gently to clear your ears. Do not blow too hard or you could damage your eardrums. These ear clearing methods must be used before discomfort is felt. It is extremely difficult to equalize your ears if a blockage has occurred and the pressure differential has become too great. If you or your passengers experience trouble clearing your ears while descending, stop the descent and climb back up to a higher altitude until the lower pressure relieves the discomfort. You can then descend again, but this time more slowly, clearing your ears continuously to prevent another blockage. Continuing a descent with an ear blockage can result in a ruptured eardrum or burst capillaries inside the inner ear. There is no way to manually control the venting of the sinus cavities. If you have a bad head cold or sinus condition, do not fly. Flying with blocked sinuses can result in severe pain between the eyes and the forehead and may even result in bleeding from the sinus membranes. Our bodies consist of up to 60% water, and we require 2 to 4 quarts of new water each day to keep our systems running properly. Our comfort zone is 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit with 25 to 50% relative humidity. Sun-baked ramps and the greenhouse heating of air trapped inside aircraft cockpits can run temperatures up to well over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Cockpit avionics can push temperatures even higher. High humidity will limit the effectiveness of sweating to help cool our bodies. Studies have shown that as body temperature increases, there is an increase in error rate in motor skills, mental functioning, and short-term memory. Hot conditions also increase irritability, hostility, and frustration, increasing the instances of interpersonal friction, loss of tempers, and miscommunication. Without enough water, our physical and mental abilities decline. The first noticeable effect of dehydration is fatigue, which can be followed by sleepiness, dizziness, headache, cramps, and nausea. Drinking enough fluids is especially important when performing physical exercise and when exposed to hot temperatures. Flying at high altitudes and breathing aviation oxygen are especially dehydrating. The cockpit air at high altitudes ranges from 3 to 5% humidity, and aviation oxygen contains zero moisture to prevent water from freezing up the system at low temperatures. This means a pilot is losing moisture from their lungs and skin at a rate of 2 to 4 ounces per hour. The smart pilot makes sure he or she drinks plenty of water before flying and carries a water bottle on long flights. You often don't feel thirsty until after you approach a 1.5 quart deficit, so drink before you feel thirsty. Also, try to stay away from too much coffee, tea, caffeinated sodas, and alcohol. All of these drinks are diuretics, which cause you to urinate more than usual to flush the associated impurities from your system, and caffeine and sugar can inhibit the absorption of water. When exposed to high temperatures for long periods, or when performing exercises, it is possible to suffer heat exhaustion or heat stroke. Mild heat stroke causes loss of physical and mental abilities. Severe heat stroke can result in unconsciousness and even death. Heat stroke symptoms consist of feeling hot, often without sweating, dizziness and fainting, muscle weakness and cramps, rapid heartbeat and breathing, nausea and vomiting, confusion, disorientation, seizures, and unconsciousness. When flying during hot weather, be sure to stay properly hydrated and try to find shade and fresh air. This can be difficult in a bubble canopy aircraft, so drink plenty of water. Wear loose-fitting, light-colored clothing and a hat. If possible, use a canopy shade and make use of air vents and other cockpit ventilation and cooling. Stress and fatigue. Stress and fatigue can seriously reduce a pilot's ability to fly safely. Airline pilots are required to have at least 10 hours of rest, which includes 8 hours for sleep before any flight duty. They are also prohibited from flying more than 30 hours per week or more than 8 hours in a day without a rest period. The airlines are also required to conduct fatigue education and awareness training programs for all flight crew and dispatchers. Fatigue can seriously diminish a pilot's ability to perform their tasks, and stress can prevent a pilot from focusing on his or her flying. Symptoms of fatigue include reduced speed and accuracy of performance, lapses of attention, delayed reactions, impaired reasoning, and decision-making, poor risk evaluation, reduced situational awareness, and low motivation to perform optional activities. It has been said that heavy fatigue is more debilitating to pilot performance than 3 alcoholic drinks. To reduce fatigue and the symptoms of fatigue, get plenty of sleep before the start of your flight. Before and during your flight, drink plenty of water. During long flights, periodically shift your position in your seat. Do isometric exercises, and if the cabin allows, get up and walk around periodically. Although caffeine in coffee and energy drinks has been proven to provide temporary alertness, be aware of the diuretic effects and possible resulting dehydration, and beware of the energy crash following a sugar high. When possible, try and take a nap. Many FBOs have crew rest areas with reclining chairs or bunks just for this purpose. Stress. Some stress is normal, such as when coping with a very demanding task such as flying an instrument approach in bad weather. Under this short-term stress, the body releases adrenaline, and your heart rate and blood pressure increase. All of this helps you to concentrate on the important task, and when the stressful task is over, your system returns to normal. However, under chronic stress, such as relationship problems, financial difficulties, or school or work problems, the stress does not go away. This long-term type of stress may place a burden on the pilots which they are unable to cope with. That causes their piloting performance to deteriorate below acceptable limits. Pilots under severe chronic stress should ground themselves and seek professional help. Motion sickness. Motion sickness occurs when your brain feels that there is a disagreement between what is seen and what your body feels. When flying in turbulence or while performing aerobatic maneuvers, your inner ear is supplying your brain with information about movement, changing orientation, and G-forces, while your eyes may be looking at the stationary references of the surrounding cockpit. This conflict between what you feel and what you see can lead to symptoms of motion sickness like nausea, sweating, feeling hot and faint, and finally, vomiting. An individual has little control over these symptoms. In fact, some of the world's best and most famous pilots suffered motion sickness. The good news is that most pilots build a tolerance to motion sickness with experience. There are also some tricks you can use to prevent or reduce the symptoms. Focusing your gaze on the horizon will minimize the disagreement between your eyes and your inner ears. Keep plenty of fresh air flowing into the cockpit, especially against your face. Consider even opening up the windows. When detecting the onset of air sickness symptoms, stop doing what made you sick. For example, if you're doing stalls or spins or aerobatics, stop the maneuvers and fly straight and level. Try to fly when the air is smooth and cool, such as early in the morning or at altitudes above the bases of the clouds. Concentrate on the task at hand. The pilot flying is usually not the first one to get sick. His mind is busy and doesn't have the time to be confused with secondary information. Remember when you were a kid on the playground and you spun on the merry-go-round, then jumped to the ground and couldn't walk straight? The world was spinning, you were dizzy and fell over. Well, you were experiencing vertigo. What happened was the fluid in your inner ear got to spinning along with the merry-go-round. Then, stop your movement, only to have the fluid in your balance sensors keep moving, giving you erroneous information. You can do this to yourself in an airplane too, especially when doing spins or by changing the orientation of your head while turning. When experiencing vertigo, you should look to the natural horizon for correct information. When that is not available, such as on a dark night or while flying in the clouds, you should look to your attitude flight instruments. After the confusing motion stops, normal sensory information will return. Illusions. Illusions occur when what you think you see is different from what you really see. For instance, you could confuse the lights of small boats on the water with the stars, or mistake a slanting cloud deck with the horizon. The solution for most illusions is to constant cross-check between visual and instrument references. Some other common illusions that pilots encounter are mistaking an approach to a skinny runway as being too high, or having runways that have uphill to downhill slopes, generating erroneous glide path impressions. Vision. A pilot's most important sense is vision. Understanding how your eyes work will allow you to compensate for their limitations. Light entering your eye is focused by the lens and then falls upon the retina. The retina is made up of light-sensing cells called rods and cones. Most of the cones are concentrated around the center of your vision and detect color and are responsible for a higher resolution and detailed vision. The rods, on the other hand, are located outside of the center of vision and are better at detecting movement and are very sensitive at low light levels. Each eye has a small blind spot where the optic nerve is attached to the retina. Here, there are no rods or cones. Since the nerve attaches in a slightly different place in the field of vision for each eye, the brain blends the two images together and blind spots are normally not noticeable. The blind spot can become apparent, however, when what you are looking at cannot be seen by both eyes. Empty field myopia. When looking into a hazy background or sky without prominent features, a pilot's eyes tend to relax and focus at a distance of only 10 to 30 feet away. When the eyes are focused so close, it is difficult to detect objects in the distance, such as other airplanes. To prevent this phenomenon, pilots should actively scan by shifting their gaze to different sectors and concentrating on spotting potential distant objects. By actively seeking airplanes in the distance, the eyes will maintain focused at the correct focal length. Since the eye detects motion with its peripheral vision, the search technique that works best is to concentrate momentarily on a sector of about 15 degrees in width. Stare without moving your eyes, then shift to the next sector and hold your focus there momentarily before shifting again. At each sector, look on the horizon, then above, then below, before moving to the next sector. When scanning this way, any moving target will be more obvious to the eye. Having said this, however, it is the target that stays stationary in your field of vision, the one that is not moving in relation to your flight path, that has the greatest collision potential. Night vision. When you turn out the lights at night, you can't see anything at first, but after a few minutes, you can see fairly well in the dark. Why is that? The rods of your eyes are 10,000 times more sensitive to light than your cones and are responsible for your night vision. However, they can be overwhelmed by bright lights and take up to 30 minutes to adapt to low-light environments. They also do not detect color, which is why colors are hard to see in the dark. Remember how the center of your field of vision is made up almost exclusively of cones? That means at night you have a blind spot in the middle of your view. If you are trying to pick out a small object at night, such as an airport light beacon or the strobes of a distant aircraft, you will have more success if you look slightly off-center so that the rods can pick up the target. Alcohol and drugs. Flying, at times, can be a very demanding activity. It calls for good hand-eye coordination, and even more importantly, it requires accurate perceptions and good decision-making. Substances that can dull or distort your mental and physical abilities have no place in aviation. Medical studies show that even 1 ounce of alcohol has a measurable negative short-term effect on your ability to reason and to perform complex tasks. Federal aviation regulations prohibit flying within 8 hours of consuming any alcohol. The time before flying should be extended longer if you are still under the influence after 8 hours. Regulations also prohibit flying if you're under the influence of any drugs, legal or illegal. Some over-the-counter drugs, especially those for colds and allergies, can impair your physical and mental performance. Pilots need to read the packaging carefully and consult with their aviation medical examiner before using any medication and flying. It is also important for pilots to know that it is not just the flight crew that must not fly under the influence. It is also illegal for a pilot to take a passenger flying that is drunk or suffering under the influence of drugs. A disruptive passenger can seriously compromise the safety of a flight.
Here you're coming through on your last pass, literally your last pass to go into the overhead.
Yep.
And do what we call the breakout and land.
Yep.
And so You were telling me you were in the middle of an echelon move, so which is for the sake of our audience, as you're in the turn and you're going to the breakout, the lead has moved you to the other side of the formation.
That's right. Yep.
So you're moving from the left side. You're in this move to the right side of the formation in the number 3 position, and then.
Well, obviously there's a certain amount of throttle movement to stabilize in the formation, and as I was pulling up next to the number 2 airplane, the engine quit. And then it started again. So I think, like, well, it must have been something, so I started to move back up again, move the throttle again, it quit again. This time for a lot longer, and I realized pretty much at that point, hey, you're gonna have to deal with this. So I'm now kind of regressing to patterns of behavior which I've been ingrained over years.
Yeah.
So I'm getting the airplane at the right speed. I crank the canopy open because obviously I don't want the canopy shutting if I'm going to put the airplane down. And I'm thinking, okay, this is not my best day, but I'm actually in a good position. I'm in a low-key position for a good field. And then the engine starts again. This is not an engine failure. This is a intermittent partial engine failure.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, we talked about this. This is probably much more dangerous than a straight engine quitting.
Yeah.
I was maybe at 400 or 500 feet, 150 miles an hour, the engine running kind of intermittently, and I've got to go sort of down the second half of the downwind leg. I've got to turn base to final, but I'm thinking, hey, I might be able to make this. And then I made another mistake. At that point, the tower, I could see they'd heard my call. I was kind of approaching base leg, and they're starting to shout at me, "Your gear's not down, your gear's not down." So I put the gear down.
Yeah.
At which point the engine started to run down again. So I've now got drag. I've got 180 degrees of turn to go, and that was a dumb thing to do. Clearly it's going to be an off-airport landing. Pulled the gear up, dumped the remaining flat, rolled the wings level, and continued to fly. This is the key thing, Richard. Fly the airplane as far into the crash as you can, and that's kind of in the back of my head. 3's down and safe. It was a nice thought. Unfortunately, the antenna's under the wing, and that was snapped off somewhere back in the wreckage trail, so they didn't hear it.
Yeah,
but
okay.
you know, I'm thinking of my buddies.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was a good thing to think about. You wrote a great article, Mark, that you shared with me on it, and in that you sort of summarized the things that you were happy with of how you did and the things that you would do differently. And the first thing is, I just appreciated that that's the way you think, that you come out of this thing and you were able to save yourself and cause no damage to any other people, the airplane will be fixed. And yet, just talking through you, I can still see you thinking through the next time this happens, this is what I would do differently, which to me is such an important piece of our culture in aviation. That's how we get safer and safer, is we're not afraid to put it on the table and say, these were the facts, this is what I would do differently if I could do it again.
General aviation. It's an industry comprised of 650,000 pilots flying over 200,000 aircraft. And the missions of general aviation are as diverse as its pilots and aircraft, and the individuals and businesses that own them. Unfortunately, an unacceptable number of these general aviation aircraft, their pilots and passengers, have succumbed to senseless and often tragic crashes. And the highest percentage of these crashes have been caused by human error, namely pilots making poor safety of flight decisions. What's even more alarming is that the same mistakes are being made over and over again throughout the industry. As you go through this training and watch the scenarios, we suggest that you should concentrate heavily on the error chain depicted in each scenario and how these steps ultimately lead to a crash. Ask yourself, what were the contributing factors? Were there opportunities to break the chain? Did the pilot exhibit a specific safety attitude or value system that might have influenced his decision-making? And were there direct and/or indirect pressures affecting the decisions of the pilot? Now, let's begin the scenarios. Ray owns and operates his own computer consulting business. He has worked hard during the past 8 years owning this business, but it has finally paid off. He was finally able to fulfill his lifelong dream of learning to fly and owning an airplane. For a private pilot with about 250 hours logged, he made a good choice when he bought a used Cessna 172 that was in very good condition and included a radio stack that would allow him to continue on training for his instrument rating. The prospect of being able to use his 172 for business from time to time was also exciting to Ray, and the day to do this had finally arrived. He had an important meeting scheduled for 6 p.m. that evening at his office with one of his top clients. Another client requested a service call for earlier that day in a town that was a 3-hour drive from Ray's office, but only about an hour and 15-minute flight using the 172. So Ray agreed to fly up to this location and perform the service call. That morning, Ray checked the weather, and it showed decent VFR conditions prevailed, but the forecast was for 2,000-foot ceilings and 3 miles visibility for his return to his home base, which were exactly what his personal minimums were for flying in daytime VFR. He decided to go. His destination was a busy airport, mixing airline and general aviation traffic, and an airport he'd never been to before. So Ray took a few extra minutes to study the airport runway and taxiway diagrams in order to avoid any runway incursion incidents, finishing preparing himself for the trip, and then filed his VFR flight plan. Ray arrived at his hangar with plenty of time to perform his typical detailed pre-flight of the 172. He started the engine and taxied out for takeoff. After completing his thorough run-up checklist, he was on his way. The outbound flight was enjoyable, especially since his tailwind was much stronger than forecast, and he was making a great ground speed. And Ray's airport preparation also paid off. His arrival went perfectly from his coordination with approach control in the tower to his ground operations into the ramp. Studying those airport charts surely helped. His service call was successful, except for the fact that it took 2 hours longer than he had anticipated to complete. Although he still had enough time to fly back home for his 6 p.m. appointment, his time was now tight, and he had none to spare. Ray arrived back at the airport where the weather still looked good. He elected not to take the time to update his home base weather conditions or file a flight plan for the trip home. After quickly checking his oil, Ray started up for his return flight. After picking up his clearance out of Class C airspace, he taxied out for departure. Following the takeoff and leaving Class C airspace, Ray was on his own. The weather was obviously worsening, and his ground speed was significantly lower than his outbound trip. He was beginning to become very concerned about the weather conditions and about being late for his 6 p.m. appointment. He pressed on, having to continuously maneuver to stay clear of clouds, but that task became more difficult as each minute passed on. At times, he found himself between layers of clouds with no ground contact at all. Finally, as he neared his destination, he spotted a hole and decided this was his chance to duck under the clouds. His descent became rapid, and he worried that he wouldn't break out when he reached his personal minimums of 2,000 feet above ground. But he reasoned that he was in a familiar area and decided that if he was ever going to get into his home field, he had to keep going now. Not having tuned into the ASOS, he was unaware that the weather conditions had diminished even more significantly at his home base field. Hal was the type that is successful in everything he does. His chain of pawn and gun shops throughout the southeast United States had done very well over the past 30 years. He was not afraid of hard work, demanded peak performance from his employees, and it showed in his business results. But his greatest passion was his flying. Since the days of his first flying lesson many years prior, Hal approached his flying with a fierce intensity and desire to excel. He bought his first airplane immediately after getting his private license and began obtaining additional ratings. As his business grew, he upgraded airplanes so that he could more effectively visit his regional stores. Although the higher performance aircraft rewarded Hal's thirst for a challenge and return on investment, he most enjoyed flying them just for fun and could often be found visiting small grass strips in out-of-the-way places. And when Hal finally sold his chain of stores and retired, he immediately sold his business airplane and bought a tailwheel sport plane, similar to what he learned in. Hal was now back doing what he enjoyed most, flying for fun. He spent some time refreshing himself on tailwheel airplane flying techniques, which did not present a significant problem to Hal, and he didn't expect it to. He also had an instructor friend work with him for a few hours, mainly to show him a few basic aerobatic maneuvers. The day had finally come when Hal was to make good on a promise to take one of his longtime friends for a ride in his new plane. His friend Larry had been looking forward to this and was ready to go. Larry had flown with Hal many times in other planes, so he was not only comfortable around small planes, but he had a high degree of confidence in Hal's abilities. Hal briefed Larry on the particulars of the new plane, and they were soon departing. The flight started quite well, and Hal and Larry were having a good time. Hal then demonstrated one of his newly learned aerobatic maneuvers, which Larry thought was great. Larry then asked Hal if they could fly over his house because he had family visiting and they knew he was flying with Hal. So Hal agreed and they found Larry's house. After a few circles, Larry asked Hal to go lower and buzz the house, which Hal did. Then Larry asked Hal to do one of those great rolls he did earlier. Hal hesitated at first, then reasoned that it couldn't be any more difficult than it was at altitude and agreed to try the low altitude roll. So on the next pass, Hal went ahead and entered the rolling maneuver. Guy was a successful consultant for a prominent commercial insurance firm. He was also an experienced pilot with commercial and instrument ratings and thousands of hours of accident-free flying logged over the past 20 years. His present airplane, a Cardinal RG, was one he had owned for the past 5 years. He took his aircraft ownership seriously. He would regularly take recurrent flight training to keep his skills sharp, practice his basic skills often, and took an equally active role in the maintenance of his airplane. He recently treated himself to a completely new avionics stack for his plane, and he was understandably anxious to take a trip with his new gear. He felt he deserved it as a reward for the high-pressure, long-hour work environment of his profession. It wasn't long before the opportunity for that trip came about. He had just signed a new high-profile client, and his boss told him to take a few days off. Because Guy was also a certified scuba diver, he decided to fly his newly equipped plane to a resort location for 2 days of diving. On Saturday night, after he finally wrapped up his paperwork, he carefully planned his trip for a Sunday morning outbound flight, 2 days of diving, and a Wednesday return. The next morning, he did another weather check, worked up a weight and balance, and filed his VFR flight plan since the weather was perfect. He also calculated that the trip could be done non-stop and still have him arrive with at least 1 hour of fuel remaining, which was his personal minimum. After a detailed pre-flight inspection, including a visual fuel inspection, Guy loaded the airplane with his luggage and dive gear and departed for his vacation. Once level in cruise, Guy pulled out the instructions on his new avionics and began playing with the equipment. The time went by quickly for him, and it didn't seem long before he was entering the pattern for his diving destination. The next morning, his diving activities began. This first day was his planned heaviest day of diving, with a shorter day of shallow dives planned for the second day, so that he would have plenty of time to rid his body of nitrogen before his Wednesday flight home. His first dive of the first day was a deep dive to explore a wreck, followed by a more shallow reef dive to finish out the morning. That afternoon, he dove another wreck in relatively deep water and then finished out his first day of diving with a night dive later that evening. His problems began when he returned to the hotel and received a voicemail to call his boss at the office no matter how late it was. During the call, Guy's boss told him that the new business deal was starting to go real bad and the client demanded a lunch meeting for tomorrow. Arguing the issue didn't seem to be an option for Guy, so he said he'd depart first thing in the morning and be there by lunch. He was a little concerned about the time between his last dive and the flight, but figured it would be enough. Early the next morning, he checked the weather and filed an IFR flight plan because there were some IMC conditions along the route. Then he called the FBO and ordered a top-off for his departure. The line crew fueled the plane before he got there, but did not top it off correctly, leaving the plane short of full tanks. Guy hurriedly pre-flighted and climbed in for departure. In his haste, he didn't visually check his fuel levels this time, nor did he even review his total gallons purchased when he signed the credit card bill. He believed he had full fuel by his gauges, even though he knew his plane could indicate full even when not completely topped off. He quickly got into the air for his homebound trip. This flight home wasn't nearly as enjoyable. Guy was consumed with the varying weather conditions, dealing with his new and unfamiliar radios under IFR, worrying about his business deal, and also wondering why he was having such discomfort in his arm and fingers, which worsened as the trip progressed. With about an hour left to go in his destination, Guy suddenly realized that his fuel gauges were indicating quite low. He had also forgotten to do his regularly scheduled tank switching routine for long cross-country flights, and his selector had been on both for the entire trip. The weather had finally improved, and with nothing but wooded terrain ahead between Guy and his destination, he briefly considered stopping and checking his fuel. But the discomfort in his arm and unfamiliarity with his new navigation equipment and his belief that he didn't have the time to go to another airport and make his appointment caused him to quickly abandon that idea and hurry home instead. Plus, he reasoned that his total time for this leg would be about the same as his outbound leg. He did get his tanks topped off, and his gauges must be wrong. So, he continued on for his home base. David is a privately rated pilot with an instrument rating and about 350 total flying hours. Most of his experience was flying a Cessna 182. In the nearly 2 years since he received his instrument rating, David's proficiency had digressed, reflecting the fact that he didn't spend much time on his skills. He was mostly a kick-the-tires, light-the-fire kind of pilot, which showed in just about everything he did with his plane. His pre-flight preparation was usually minimal, and he never considered weight and balance. He would quickly go through the pre-flight and takeoff checks. His takeoffs became more hurried and were never consistent, and his en-route routine was to usually let the autopilot do all the flying. Even when going into unfamiliar airports, no matter what size, he would never consult the airport charts before the flight and just dealt with airport familiarization as he arrived. He would often hurry his patterns and neglect providing Unicom calls or listening for airport traffic advisories, which at times created dangerous situations. His landings were also pretty much in line with the rest of his flying skills, barely adequate and far from being precise or consistent. But the forgiving nature of the 182 when it comes to flying skills and load hauling had kept David out of trouble in spite of his declining skills. The time came when David felt like he needed to move up to a faster, more complex airplane, so he bought a Bonanza A36. The insurance company required that he receive 5 hours of instruction prior to operating the airplane on his own. His buddy, who was an instructor, provided this instruction. However, instead of using that time for a thorough transition to the Bonanza, they spent about an hour doing takeoffs and landings and then used the rest of the time to take a cross-country trip for lunch. After the checkout, David flew it for about another hour or so, mainly just cruising around the local area. He also spent plenty of time boasting to his friends about how great this plane was and how quickly he could get to his favorite resorts. The day soon came when David and 3 of his friends planned a vacation trip. He requested line service to top off the plane, and his friends arrived shortly thereafter with all of their luggage. The only thing was, an additional passenger showed up a few minutes later. Without David's knowledge, one of the friends invited the unexpected passenger along because he needed a ride to a town about 100 miles away and right along their route to pick up a car he had recently agreed to purchase. David was not very happy with his one friend offering this ride without his knowledge, but took a quick look at the sectional chart to find the airport and determine the runway length. With about 2,800 feet of runway shown, he figured the plane could handle it, didn't want to say no, and continued loading everyone and their luggage. Not having done a weight and balance calculation, he was totally unaware that the airplane would be overloaded and out of CG. In his typical fashion, David didn't waste any time getting out to the runway. The takeoff was nothing like he'd experienced before in the Bonanza. This was his first takeoff in the A36 with a full load. and was actually overgross, which significantly degraded the plane's takeoff performance. However, with the runway being over 5,000 feet, he was able to finally get the airplane off the ground, cleaned up and climbing. David was not happy with the performance of his plane. The rate of climb was far less than he was used to, but he eventually got to his cruise altitude, and once there, the airplane behaved more like he had grown accustomed. It wasn't long before he had to begin his descent for his first stop. When he arrived at the airport, he closely looked over the field at pattern altitude and noticed the trees obstructing both ends of the runway. He flew a full flap higher approach than normal for him, which resulted in his speed being faster than normal for landing on a shorter field. He was using the approach attitudes that always worked in the Cessna 182. After floating down nearly 2/3 of the runway, David decided to go around. But with full flaps, full power, heavy nose-up trim, and an overloaded airplane, David's new airplane became more than he was prepared to handle.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted. It is available for use in talks, training, and teaching on DVDs from VisCog Productions. Learn more at theinvisiblegorilla.com.